In May of 1911, the United States Supreme Court ordered the largest corporate breakup in American history. The government spent years building the case, compiled 12,000 pages of evidence, and summoned the full power of the Republic to destroy one man's empire. 6 months later, that man was 3 times richer than before. This is the story of how John D. Rockefeller turned the most famous judicial defeat of the 20th century into the greatest financial coup of his life, and how the very system designed to punish him was the same one that made him untouchable. In 1870, Standard Oil controlled 4% of the American oil market. By 1880, it controlled 90%. In 10 years, a single man in Cleveland, Ohio, had seized an entire national industry. Not with armies, not with decrees, with secret agreements, predatory pricing, and an understanding of industrial capitalism that no government of the era knew how to fight. And when the American government finally decided to act, after decades of scandal, investigation, and public pressure, the remedy it applied turned out to be the greatest gift Rockefeller ever received. If this kind of story interests you, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. And tell me in the comments, did you already suspect that the Standard Oil breakup had this kind of ending? John Davison Rockefeller was born in 1839 in New York State, the son of a traveling patent medicine salesman of questionable reputation and a devout, disciplined mother. From his mother, he inherited strict Calvinism, the habit of recording every cent spent, and the belief that wealth was a sign of divine grace. From his father, he inherited, perhaps without knowing it, an instinct for business that lived at the edges of acceptable. In 1863, at 23 years old, Rockefeller entered the oil refining business in Cleveland, partnered with Morris Clark and Samuel Andrews. Cleveland was a strategic city. It sat at the crossroads of the railroads connecting Pennsylvania's oil fields with the eastern markets. Refining crude oil into kerosene, the fuel that lit homes across the country before electric light, was a lucrative and chaotic business, dominated by dozens of small operators with no coordination. In 1865, Rockefeller bought out Clark's share and took control of the refinery. 2 years later, he brought in Henry Flagler as a partner, a man whose financial instincts perfectly complemented his own. In January of 1870, they incorporated the Standard Oil Company of Ohio, with starting capital that reflected Cleveland's largest refineries, brought together under a single structure. The company began with 4% of the market. What followed wasn't growth, it was systematic absorption. Rockefeller understood before anyone else that oil refining, on its own, was a fragile business. Crude oil prices swung violently. Demand was uncertain. Profit margins depended on a single factor over which refiners had little control: the cost of railroad transportation. Whoever controlled railroad rates would control the entire industry. Rockefeller decided to be that person. In 1868, even before Standard Oil's formal founding, the vice president of the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern Railroad had granted Rockefeller's firm its first rebates, secret discounts on freight rates. It was a known practice among railroads. Large shippers that guaranteed steady volume received lower rates. But what Rockefeller turned into a system went far beyond that. In 1872, he formalized the scheme through the South Improvement Company, an entity created specifically to negotiate with railroads on behalf of large refiners. The deal was simple and devastating. Standard Oil would pay reduced rates, and the railroads would charge competitors higher rates, then split part of that surcharge with Standard. Rockefeller's rivals would pay to subsidize his dominance. When Pennsylvania's oil producers discovered the scheme, the reaction was immediate and furious. The railroads publicly backed down, abandoned the agreement, and canceled the contract. But the damage was done. Rockefeller had used the brief window the agreement was, in effect, to pressure dozens of Cleveland refiners into selling their companies at depressed prices, under the implicit threat that without access to preferential rates, they wouldn't survive. Within months, Standard Oil had absorbed the bulk of Cleveland's refining capacity. It was the pattern that would repeat itself for decades: pressure, absorption, elimination. The mechanism was brutally efficient. Wherever there was competition, Standard Oil would drop its prices below the cost of production. It could do this because its volume and preferential transport rates gave it a cost structure no rival could match. Competitors operated in the red, tried to hold out, and eventually sold, or shut down. When the competition disappeared, prices went back up. The cycle repeated itself in every new market. Standard decided to conquer. At the same time, the company systematically spied on rivals' operations, gathering intelligence on their customers, routes, and volumes through corrupted railroad employees. It ran fictitious companies that appeared independent but were secretly controlled, deceiving consumers and competitors about the true extent of its reach. In 1882, Rockefeller and his lawyer, Samuel Dodd, created the legal instrument that would give a name to an era: the trust. The Standard Oil Trust Agreement consolidated the titles of 40 companies into a single managing agency controlled by 9 trustees, with Rockefeller at its center. The original trust was valued at $70 million. Shareholders of the incorporated companies received trust certificates proportional to their stakes, and all profits from the component companies flowed through the 9 trustees, who determined dividends and elected directors across every company in the group. It was a monopoly that functioned as a single corporation, but legally appeared as a confederation of separate companies, making regulatory oversight nearly impossible. And the financial results were extraordinary. Between 1882 and 1906, Standard Oil paid $548 million in dividends, equivalent to more than $14 billion in today's money. Total net profits over the same period amounted to $838 million. The company had developed a model that extracted value from every stage of the supply chain. It controlled crude oil production, refineries, pipelines, tank car fleets, and final distribution to the consumer. By 1904, Standard Oil controlled 91% of American oil refining and 85% of final sales. It was, literally, the oil industry of the United States. But what would bring this system down would come not from a courtroom, nor from a president. It would come from a Pennsylvania journalist with a personal score to settle. Ida Tarbell was born on November 5, 1857, in Pennsylvania, in the heart of oil country. Her father, Frank Tarbell, was a wooden barrel maker, the kind of small entrepreneur that Standard Oil had systematically destroyed throughout the 1870s. She grew up watching her community be consumed by Rockefeller's machine. She became a journalist, went to Paris, returned to the United States, and in 1901 began investigating Standard Oil for McClure's magazine. What she produced over the next 3 years would be the most consequential work of investigative journalism in American history. Between November 1902 and May 1904, McClure's published 19 of Tarbell's articles on Standard Oil, detailing the secret rebates, the espionage schemes, the fictitious companies, the predatory pricing, and the systematic destruction of competitors. The work was compiled into 2 volumes, published in 1904 under the title The History of the Standard Oil Company. In 1999, a jury from New York University's journalism department would select the book as the 5th greatest work of American journalism of the 20th century. But the immediate impact was political. The American public, which already distrusted the great trusts, now had a precise, documented, and human narrative of what they actually did. The pressure for government action became irresistible. This is where the story begins to reveal its more uncomfortable layers. Because Tarbell was not exactly a neutral observer. Her brother William worked as an executive at the Pure Oil Company, one of Standard Oil's main competitors. William's boss had been an important witness before the United States Industrial Commission, a body that had played a central role in pushing for antitrust action. And William was feeding Ida inside information about the industry's internal operations. The journalist who triggered the largest antitrust action in American history had very personal reasons for wanting to see Standard Oil destroyed, and access to sources no outside journalist would ever have had. That doesn't invalidate what she documented. The crimes were real. The practices were illegal and devastating. But it reveals that the public narrative about Standard Oil, the story that reached the government and the courts, was built, at least in part, by interests that had as much to gain from Standard's destruction as any consumer harmed by its monopoly pricing. The Cato Institute itself, in an analysis published in June of 2025, described the case as a story of anti-competitive rent-seeking disguised as a fight for the common man. What appeared to be a battle between state power and corporate power was also a battle between the country's greatest monopolist and his commercial rivals, who used the government as a weapon. In November of 1906, the Justice Department under Theodore Roosevelt filed suit against Standard Oil of New Jersey under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. The government report ran 12,000 pages and documented 40 years of business practices that systematically excluded competitors. After a 15-month trial, the lower court issued a dissolution decree in November of 1909. Standard Oil appealed. The case went to the Supreme Court. On May 15, 1911, Chief Justice Edward White read the unanimous decision. Standard Oil had illegally monopolized the American oil industry and would be dissolved. The decision also established a far-reaching legal principle, the so-called rule of reason, which held that antitrust law prohibited only unreasonable restraints of trade. Size alone was not a crime. Predatory conduct was. The court ordered the company to split into approximately 39 independent entities with separate boards. It was an unprecedented victory for the regulatory power of the American state. What happened in the weeks and months that followed was the most scandalous reversal in antitrust history. Because Rockefeller owned approximately 1/4 of all Standard Oil shares, he received 1/4 of the shares in each of the 30-odd companies created by the breakup. The market, which until then had viewed the entire consolidated structure as a single entity that was difficult to value, could now price each company separately. And the market liked very much what it saw. The shares of the resulting companies soared. The aggregate value of the parts far exceeded the value of the prior whole. At the time of the dissolution, Rockefeller was worth approximately $300 million. By the end of 1913, his net worth had grown to more than $900 million. In 2 years, he had tripled his fortune. As a percentage of American GDP, his wealth came to represent roughly 3% of the entire economy, equivalent to approximately $418 billion in today's money. No modern billionaire has come close to that proportionally. Elon Musk's fortune at its peak represented less than 1% of American GDP, less than 1/3 of Rockefeller's economic footprint. The American government did not punish Rockefeller. The American government multiplied Rockefeller's wealth. The companies created by the breakup, known as the baby standards, did not fade quietly away. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon, today ExxonMobil, one of the largest corporations on the planet. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil, which merged with Exxon in 1999. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco, absorbed by BP. Standard Oil of Ohio was also acquired by BP. Saudi Aramco, the Saudi Arabian state oil company, the most valuable corporation in modern history, traces its origins directly to Standard Oil of California, which was the original partner in the development of Arabian oil. Even the credit agency TransUnion descends from Standard Oil, spun off from the Union Tank Car Company. The 1911 breakup did not destroy Rockefeller's empire. It multiplied it, spread it across the world, and buried it so deep in the structure of the global economy that, more than 100 years later, it is impossible to imagine the energy market without the companies born from that judicial decision. The United States Supreme Court broke Standard Oil into pieces, and every piece grew up to become a giant. The irony did not go unnoticed by contemporaries. But what it reveals goes beyond Rockefeller's financial paradox. It reveals something about the nature of monopolistic power once it reaches a certain scale. Standard Oil had grown so large, integrated so many parts of the productive chain, controlled so many critical assets, that no court decree could undo its structural logic. You could separate the companies on paper, but the pipelines were still where they had always been. The refineries kept running. The technical and managerial knowledge stayed with the same families and the same teams. The natural barriers to entry in the oil industry, capital intensity, critical infrastructure, economies of scale, kept existing and kept favoring the companies that already dominated the sector. There was something even more unsettling. At the time of the dissolution, Standard Oil's market share had already fallen to 64%, with at least 147 competing companies operating in the United States. Companies like Gulf, Texaco, and Shell were already competing vigorously. Some economic historians argue that Standard Oil was naturally losing its monopoly even before the court's decision, that the government's action was a response to a problem the market itself was already correcting, only in a way too invisible to satisfy the political demand for punishment. Others argue the opposite, that without government action, Standard would have absorbed the new competitors the same way it had absorbed all the others. The debate persists, but the incontestable fact is that the American government mounted the largest antitrust case in history, spent years and enormous resources executing it, and the final result was to enrich the man who was being prosecuted. Rockefeller lived until 1937, dying at 97, with an estimated fortune of $1.5 billion, making him the first documented billionaire in world history. He spent the last decades of his life distributing money in a systematic and methodically planned way, founding the University of Chicago, creating the Rockefeller Foundation, funding medical research that would eradicate diseases. He was the same man who had ordered the surveillance of competitors, practiced predatory pricing to destroy small businessmen, and bribed railroads to consolidate a monopoly that suffocated an entire industry. The philanthropy and the industrial crime carried the same signature. What the story of Standard Oil reveals is not simply that Rockefeller was exceptional, though he was. It reveals that there is a level of concentrated economic power beyond which the conventional tools of control stop working as expected. American antitrust law was born to contain that power. In its most important test, it turned the monopolist into the greatest beneficiary of his own defeat. Not because the system failed, but because the system worked exactly as it was built to work, protecting private property, honoring contracts, ensuring that shareholders received the value of their assets, even in dissolution. Rockefeller did not win in spite of the law. He won through it. Every generation has its own version of this story. The companies change. The sectors change. The names of the executives change. But the mechanism by which economic power reaches a scale that makes it immune to the tools created to regulate it, that mechanism remains. If you look at today's market data and recognize the structure, it is not a coincidence. It is continuity. If you want to keep understanding how that mechanism works throughout history, subscribe to the channel. Each episode is a piece of the same puzzle. Give it a like if this ending surprised you. And tell me in the comments, which company today do you think is repeating the same pattern?